Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. For my weekly reading report, it's time for my weekly reading report, the fantastic program where I talk about all the stuff that I read last week. And I did read some stuff last week, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about the stuff I read last week. Let me break out my list here for the 500 book challenge, the challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I will buy any new ones. The never-ending challenge, where we are at, let's see. Okay, let's start with book 218. Book 218 for the 500 book challenge, which was this one, which I talked about a little bit last week, Shadows with Eyes. Shadows with Eyes by Fritz Leiber. Love that cover. So this is a collection of 6 stories by Fritz Leiber, 6 horror stories. And man, this is a great collection. I really enjoyed this book. Leiber is such a great writer. Best known, of course, for Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, a sword and sorcery series. But he wrote all kinds of things, fantasy, science fiction, and horror. He wrote some great horror stories, and some of them are in this collection. I don't like to give books star ratings. I kind of have to on Goodreads. But overall, I don't really like to give books star ratings. But if I were to give a book a star rating, this comes really close to 5 stars, I think, because it was almost perfect. But the last story in this is not great, in my opinion. So that knocked it down a bit. But the 5 stories before that were pretty great. The last story, let me get the title of the last story. The last story was called A Desk Full of Girls. And it's about as good as that title suggests. But all the other stories in this collection are fantastic. And so if you ever find this lying around, Shadows with Eyes, pick it up. It's worth it. Like I said, Leiber wrote some great horror stories. And this was a lot of fun and just a really good read. Good horror. So there you go. Shadows with Eyes, 6 Tales of Crawling Horror. So I finished that. Book number 219. Excuse me, book number 218. Book 219 was this one. It's The Spider. Yes, it's another spider novel. Spider, the City of Flaming Shadows. City of Flaming Shadows. So this is from the 4th issue of the Spider magazine, a hero pulp from the 1930s. The Spider started his career as kind of a knockoff of the Shadow. The Shadow was a tremendously popular hero pulp. Really is the character that got the hero pulps going. And the Spider started off as kind of a Shadow knockoff. You know, we have this dark character who lurks in the shadows, carries a couple 45s, shoots the bad guys, takes care of business, you know. Most of the Spider novels were written by Norville Page under the house name of Grant Stockbridge, but he didn't write all of them. There were other writers who wrote The Spider, but Page wrote the best Spider stories. And he wrote this one for issue number 4. I think this was his 2nd Spider story. But already in this, you have all of the elements that make a great Norville Page Spider story, because the Spider was kind of unique. He started off as being a knockoff of the Shadow, that is true, but very quickly he developed his own psychotic personality. He's kind of crazy, this guy. In his civilian identity as, I think it was Richard Wentworth. Yeah, Richard Wentworth, I'm pretty sure. He's a rich playboy, of course, who becomes the Spider to fight crime. He has a friend in the police commissioner who's convinced he's the Spider but can't prove it. And he becomes more convinced every single Spider adventure. Wentworth, I have to say, is absolutely the worst at keeping a secret identity. The commissioner is convinced he's the Spider because he's clearly the Spider. unlike the Shadow, who is enormously capable, and the Shadow's a mysterious character. We don't really know his emotions or feelings or any of that stuff usually. The Spider is a very emotional character, and he's obsessed with fighting crime. It's a kind of a holy mission for him because he's a nut, clearly. His poor girlfriend, Nita, every Spider novel practically, she's kidnapped and very often tortured. If she wasn't such a strong person, she would probably be the most traumatized character in all of literature. And the Spider, unlike the Shadow, is not enormously capable. If you compare the Spider to, say, Doc Savage and the Shadow and a lot of other heroes, the Spider is a complete screw up. Despite the pulps themselves, when you read them, telling you how capable Richard Wentworth is and how great the Spider is at everything, he screws up constantly. And he always defeats the villains barely. He barely makes it through. Everything that can go wrong usually does go wrong for the Spider in the Spider novels. And that's what makes them fascinating, because you're reading these books and you're like, oh my God, how is this guy going to get out of this? Because he literally barely survives and he barely wins out at the end of every Spider pulp. And it's just fascinating to watch this kind of incompetent pulp hero bungle his way through his adventures. And it's awesome. I mean, it's just so much fun. And the pace of these things is fantastic. They shoot along like a rocket, these stories. And they're always enormous fun. So the Spider, if you ever see any of these Spider books lying around, or read them. I mean, they're amazing, especially the Norville Page ones. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to know who wrote the story. Certainly this edition doesn't tell you, but you can look it up online and that'll tell you which ones Page wrote and which ones he didn't. But they're fantastic. Yeah, I love the Spider. He's definitely one of my favorites. Just the sheer entertainment value of these things. Pure pulp, the Spider. And so, yeah, there you go. The Spider, City of Flaming Shadows. Last year, I read the story from the 3rd issue of the Spider. This one isn't quite that good, but it's almost that good. And it has all the elements that come to be so important in the Spider novels, where you have a master villain, a mysterious evil supervillain. You have a city in peril. All of New York is in peril. And also all of the country, and possibly the entire world. And only the Spider can save the day. Barely. So, yeah, there you go. The Spider. That was fantastic. I loved that. So, now I'm at book number 220. It was, of course, The Wasted Weekend. Unfortunately, my wasted weekend was terribly busy, and so I wasn't able to waste it. I worked on Saturday. Yesterday was just had so much to do. So I wasn't able to read as much as I wanted. The Wasted Weekend, of course, is an event created by the fantastic Criminale, who also created Garbogust, which is happening in 6 months. The Wasted Weekend is kind of a tiny little weekend's worth of Garbogust, where you read a trashy book. That's the whole goal. Read a trashy book. And my trashy book was The Human Termites by David H. Keller, MD. Dr. Termite himself with The Human Termites. Good choice, as it turns out, for The Wasted Weekend. I haven't finished it yet because, like I said, my weekend could not entirely be wasted. But I'm almost finished with The Human Termites, and then I have to read The Ambassador from Mars, which is the second part of this book, because it's a double. The Human Termites, man, this book is interesting. So this, I believe, was originally published in the Pulp. Was it Super Science Stories? I can't remember. I know it wasn't Amazing Stories. I thought at first it was, but it wasn't. It was another Pulp, Super Science Stories or something. I can't remember. But it was serialized. And if you look at the cover, this book is kind of what you see on the cover. I mean, it's reminiscent of all of those 1950s giant bug monster movies that came out, in the 50s. This came out in the 1920s, so it was ahead of its time as far as that goes. And it is kind of like that. You do have a massive army of gigantic termites out to destroy the world. But there's a little bit more to it than that. The first two chapters are a little slow. It begins with a scientist who's studying termites. Now, I have to give it to David H. Keller, MD, because you can tell he heavily researched termites and everything that was known about termites at the time before he wrote this, because he puts it all in this book. And we have a scientist who's studying termites. And his whole life is dedicated to studying termites. And he discovers that the termites have a language and they're speaking to each other. And it turns out that the termites are, every colony of termites, every termite hive, it's all one organism. All the termites are part of one living creature, a hive mind. And the termites have decided that they're tired of human beings and they are going to destroy humanity and take over the world, as you would expect, And this freaks out the scientists. And it turns out that while the scientist was studying the termites were studying the scientist. So they know that he has learned what he has learned. And so they try to stop him, but he gets away. And he finds another young scientist and tells him this story, which is clearly a crazy crackpot story that nobody would believe. But this young scientist believes him. And the young scientist gets the help of this very rich banker guy and this rich banker's sister. And they all get together and they're going to fight the termites. And so they form an expedition to go back and check out the termite hive that the scientist had discovered. And it turns out that the termites are creating these human termite hybrid creatures and turning humans into giant termites, like these gigantic termite monsters. This is all found out by the real hero of the story, who is a young woman named Suzanne, who's the sister of the banker, and falls in love with our young scientist. There's a picture of her here. There's young Suzanne there, and she discovers this lumpy thing, which it turns out that this is the brain, the living brain that's controlling all of the termite monsters. It's controlling the termite hive and all of the termite monsters. And it turns out all the termite colonies have a big brain like this lurking under the ground. And so she finds this brain, the brain who can speak English, and as it turns out, is very, very polite. He's like, "Oh, hello, I'm the human termite brain. Welcome. Allow me to show you around." And he gives the young woman Suzanne a tour of his underground horrors, and she sees all of the massive termites. She sees these poor young women who are turned into these breeding machines to create more termite monsters. There's a lot of really horrifying stuff that she discovers in this termite hive. And of course, she's the bravest character in this book. So she was the only one brave enough to go and find out all of this stuff. And she barely escapes with her life. But she's a great character, Suzanne, by the way. I mean, she's a crack shot. She's really the hero of this story. Which is interesting for a story written in the 1920s. And then, of course, the termites invade the world. At the point I'm at now, the termite horde, this army of gigantic monster termites, is attacking humanity and slowly destroying humanity. They've completely wiped out Australia. They're going across all the islands. They've destroyed Japan. And they have just now started to attack San Francisco. No, not San Francisco, Oakland. They decided to attack Oakland before San Francisco. Oakland, man. Poor city. Anyway, there's a lot of that going on. A lot of termite monster business. And it's enormously fun. It has some interesting ideas. Like, not only, as it turns out, are the termite hordes controlled by a single brain, but human beings actually, we don't know it, but we are all part of a single organism as well. And lurking underneath the earth in various countries is a brain that controls human beings. We just don't realize it. And so that's part of this story as well. There's some interesting ideas in this book. The whole thing is enormously pulpy as far as the writing is concerned. David H. Keller, his writing ability is right there at pulp level. You could tell he has some really cool ideas. But unfortunately, a lot of his stories have kind of been forgotten, I think. This is the only book version of The Human Termites, for example, that I know of. I think this is the only time it's been published as a book is this right here. I mean, it's very pulpy. I mean, the characters very often speak in ways that human beings would never speak. I mean, and behave in ways human beings just wouldn't behave outside of a pulp story. So there's a lot of that going on. But it's fun. It's a lot of fun, The Human Termites. I'll probably finish this today and move on to The Ambassador from Mars. Who knows how this is going to be. And book number 220 is going to be this one. It's going to be The Forever War, which I've only heard good things about. The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. So I'm really looking forward to this. I have been reading some other stuff, so let's talk about that really quickly. I have been reading the Fantastic Four, of course. I've been reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four that ran from the early 1960s, 1961, I think, until 1996. And I'm over halfway through. I'm at issue 215. I'm reading these issues in the Marvel Masterworks series at this point, which I have electronically. So this one is Blastar. And these issues are written by Marv Wolfman and illustrated by John Byrne. And I have to say, Marv Wolfman is fantastic on the Fantastic Four. I think there's been some good Fantastic Four issues since the Jack Kirby Stan Lee run. I mean, this is a comic book that's stayed good after they left. But Marv Wolfman, I think, is the best writer on the book since Stan Lee left. Which is surprising because Roy Thomas wrote some Fantastic Four issues, which were good, but these Marv Wolfman issues have been fantastic. And John Byrne is just, of course, a great comic book illustrator, great artist. So yeah, it's these 1979 issues of the Fantastic Four have been just great. So I'm at a really good point, and of course we're moving into the 80s pretty soon, and we're coming up on the point where John Byrne is going to be taking over the writing and the illustrating of the Fantastic Four, and that I remember being pretty great. That was one of the best periods of the Fantastic Four. So some good stuff ahead and some good stuff right now. The Fantastic Four, the quality on that comic has been really good. Also, we have to talk about the vampire in the room, Varney. Oh, Varney the Vampire. So, Varney the Vampire, The Feast of Blood. This is the Pulplit Productions edition of Varney the Vampire. And if you're going to get a physical copy of Varney the Vampire, this is the one to get. Because it's got the great illustrations, all in the proper places. It's been completely retypeset. It's a good edition of Varney. So Varney, as I've mentioned before, is not a novel. It was a penny dreadful that was published weekly for years. And it was kind of like a soap opera, an ongoing soap opera, which had different storylines. And the editor of this particular edition, what was his name again? The editor, Finn J.D. John divides up Varney the Vampire into different parts, and each part is a storyline. And the first storyline takes up this whole book, and this was when Varney the Vampire first showed up on the scene to torment the Bannerworth family and drive them out of house and home and steal their money and being all around a kind of a terrible person. And Varney the Vampire is successful. He does steal the Bannerworth's money and gets away. But that takes up this entire first volume. That's all one storyline. And so I read all of that. And then recently, I finished part 2. And in part 2 of Varney the Vampire, who has successfully gotten away with the Bannerworth's money, he impersonates a baron. So he's taken on a new identity of this super rich baron. And he tries to marry a young woman of pure heart. And there's another vampire that shows up that knows who he really is, and there's all kinds of shenanigans. Eventually, Varney is exposed by Admiral Bell, who is a big part of the first storyline. The Bannerworths are in the second storyline, but they really don't have much to do at this point because their story is pretty much done. And so I finished part 2, and so now I'm moving on to part 3. Like I said, there's a few more parts because the rest of the storylines don't take up as many pages. They're all shorter storylines from here on out. And I really don't know what's in store in part 3. I have heard that we're finally going to get more vampire horror in here. Like Varney the Vampire might actually start acting like a vampire, which at this point he kind of hasn't that much. I mean, he never sucks anybody's blood, hardly ever. You know, it's just, I'm looking forward to some more vampire action in part 3 and going forward. So we will see. So yeah, moving on to part 3 in Varney. As far as pages, I'm at page 855, but they're all double columned. I mean, this is an enormous book, and I still have that much to go, so I'm at 60-something% or something, of Varney. So continuing to read Varney, and it will take forever. But you know what? This is a Penny Dreadful that was produced weekly for years, so I can go slow if I want. But the real challenge is in the immediate future, because when I finish the Forever War, I'm moving on to something enormous. It's finally time to read It. I am reading every book by Stephen King in publication order, as the stories were published under his own name. And I'm finally at this point where I have to read It. But the problem is, when am I going to read It, right? Because there are all these events and things coming up. So the next reading event is coming up in May for Horror Mayhem. And so even no matter when I read this, it's going to be enormously disruptive to everything else that I'm doing. It's an 1,100-page book, a gigantic horror novel. And so I figured now is probably the best time to read it. Because if I can't read the other stuff that I want to read this month, I could push it off into next month. But this, I can't really read it during like Garb August or something else like that because it would take up all of that time. So yeah, end of February, we're going to be starting to read It. I don't know how I'm going to manage to finish it in a decent amount of time, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I did read this in the 1980s, shortly after it came out. I did have I had the first edition hardcover of It, long since gone, because I had no idea that it would actually be of any value, because it was a Stephen King book. But I did have the original hardcover of this back in the 80s, and I read that, I had mixed feelings about this book. I remember thinking it was just way too long, and there were some things in it that were like, and not in a good way. But I've discovered as I've been rereading Stephen King for this Read Every Book by challenge, I've been realizing that I've enjoyed these books a lot more now as an adult than I did when I was a teenager reading this stuff. So we'll see what I think of it. It should be interesting because it's been decades and decades since I've read this book. And I read it once. What was I, 17 or something? I can't remember what year this book came out. 1986 something? If it was 86, then I was 15. We'll see. I was 15 or 16 or something like that when this came out. But now I'm ancient, so, not as ancient as you, Roger. But we'll see. This is going to be the challenge ahead. We'll see how that goes. I will talk more about that, obviously, when I see you next week for the weekly reading report. I will catch you next time.